Sorry, everybody out there for our technical difficulties. Unfortunately, due to some technical problems on our end, we're not going to be able to air this live. But if you're watching this right now, you're watching a premiere of this video. So in a way, it's like we're doing a live video, and we'll be doing live commentary in the comments as well. But this is, we're going to, unfortunately, due to those technical problems, we're just going to continue rolling on with this, and we will, as you are watching, you will see this be published a little bit later. So John, we are going to be talking about dreams in the Civil War, and going to talk specifically about your book, Midnight in America. Could you give for the audience kind of an overview of what the book is, and what some of your aims were with writing that book?
Sure. I had the idea to write the book around 2008, and my original plan was to try to write a chronological history of the war from Fort Sumter to Appomattox that would explore the war through the dream experiences of those who were on the battlefield and on the home front. I began collecting dream reports around then, but I very quickly realized that it would be impossible to do a chronological narrative of the war that way. So I ended up, once I had gathered several hundred dream reports, I began to think about the different patterns that emerged in them, and I organized the book then topically. So I have a chapter on what sleep looked like for soldiers during the war. I have a chapter on soldiers' dreams, a chapter on civilians' dreams, a chapter on slaves' dreams, a chapter on how dreams were depicted in popular culture, and then a chapter on Lincoln's dreams.
Excellent. Thinking about the book, which I'm trying to remember when I read it, back towards like right after it came out. Was always struck by this topic because it's just so fascinating. To dive in. It kind of gets you to this next level of understanding what the soldier experience was like, but also of all of those people living through the 19th century's most important moment in American history.
Yeah, I think looking at their dreams gives us a different window into sort of the emotional experience that they had during the war. And it's funny because, dreams mean a lot to us today. A lot of people think about their dreams or tweet about them or tell their friends about if they have a really interesting or impactful dream. And I think dreams meant even more to people back then. For a lot of people, they had a sort of spiritual meaning. They might be a sign from God in terms of what they should do or what might be coming or something that dangerous that they should look out for. And so because dreams meant so much to them, they placed a lot of value in them and made sure to tell people about them. And so you find soldiers and their wives writing back and forth to each other. And oftentimes they would include a little snippet about their dreams at the end of a letter, something like, "I dreamt of you last night," or oftentimes even more specific than that.
Yeah, I can remember, a couple of occasions of coming across these in my own research. One from a doctor who was at Antietam, writing in the weeks after the battle about wishing that he was home. Had a dream about his wife and family back in New Hampshire. Another from Antietam of a soldier who, after being wounded on the battlefield there, dreams about kind of mashed up all of the terrors of combat, all into one kind of horrific dream. And I was always struck by these, and it sounds like you really were as well. And what made me so keen to get you on to our Facebook and to do one of these videos with you is reading in the last couple of weeks and experiencing this myself, of having very vivid dreams as we were experiencing this, a global crisis, something that in our lifetimes we haven't really quite seen. And this has given me, and I think it's given many, many other people as well, kind of some insights into what it may have been like to experience the Civil War.
I think that's right. One of the things that modern sleep science tells us is that the more exhausted you are, the more vivid your dreams are. And so you've got these men who are away on the battlefield, not getting very good sleep at night, tired from miles and miles of marching. And so they're so exhausted that when they fall asleep and dreams, their dreams just feel so real to them. And the most common dream that I found was soldiers dreaming of home, dreaming of their wives, their parents, their children, hugging and kissing their wives, dreaming of things from home that they missed. I found a Wisconsin soldier who was stuck down in Georgia, and he dreams about cheese that his mother had written about in a letter. So they're dreaming about home, but the dreams are so vivid that when they wake up in the morning, they're often upset because they thought they were at home with their loved ones and they were really on the battlefield in a dog tent. I found one guy from New York who woke up one morning after having a dream of his wife, and he was so angry. He was stationed outside of Baltimore at the time. He was so angry when he woke up that he went into town and got drunk, and that was kind of how he coped with it.
Wow. I mean, yeah, it's fascinating to kind of, again, thinking of, our modern insights, and I know that we view dreams a lot differently, but I think this is one of the ways that we can find kind of some relevance of the Civil War, because we are all kind of experiencing these dreams. I know that I've had one of those dreams of home, because I've been away from my family, living in Washington. My family's back in Pennsylvania for,
Right.
several months now. I know it's nothing compared to what the Civil War soldiers experienced, but again, it's one of those kind of connections. So just a, question, is there any difference between, sleep patterns in the Civil War and what were Civil War soldiers' sleeping patterns?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, their patterns were to not really have a good pattern. And so, depending on where they were or what they were doing at any given time, they were often utterly exhausted. And so, I look at one soldier named Wyman White, who has a memoir that was published a number of years ago. And he was put on duty over and over and over again, night after night, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. And he eventually got to the breaking point where he couldn't just sleep in little 2 hour blocks of time. And he wound up getting put into the guardhouse for having, you know, not been a good picket or a good guard. And it's because of the lack of sleep that he had. For other soldiers, there's so many noises or so many lights that are around them that they have difficulty sleeping, or animals that crawl into their tents. I found any number of soldiers who wrote about frogs and rats and other sort of things that would get into their tents and wake them up. And if you think about it, in the 19th century, if you're a farm boy who lives in a rural part of the country, when the sun goes down, there's not a lot of light around you. But now, when you're surrounded by 100,000 men who have campfires, there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of light that you're not used to, and that would have the impact of hurting people's sleep, especially when they were green, when they were new in the field. You'd have all these men who are in the field for the first time. They're really excited to be there, so they're especially loud. But over the course of time, I think as they become more and more exhausted, they're able to fall asleep more easily, sometimes at inopportune moments. One of the most incredible things I found was a moment where these two guys, these two Union soldiers, are at Petersburg in the summer of 1864, and they're just so exhausted that they fall asleep in the middle of a fight. And so there's cannons going off all around them, and they fall asleep, and they both dream of home. And then a shell explodes near them, and they wake up and they look at each other and they ask what they had been dreaming about, and they both say they were dreaming of home and that it was a vivid dream. And so it's this remarkable thing where the exhaustion, I guess, eventually caught up, and they could even fall asleep in battle. Whereas earlier in the war, they were probably unable to fall asleep right away when they were surrounded by noise.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you see that it's through sleep, you can see these soldiers kind of getting used to the experience of being, not only in combat, but also of just the kind of day-to-day life of a soldier.
Right.
That they're going to, adapt to, like we all do, adapt to the situations that they are around as best they can. So this kind of leads into my next question for you, John, and that is, so did soldiers view sleep as a reprieve, or were they kind of haunted by what they experienced during the war?
You see some of both. So I think the most common dream was the pleasant dream of home. In fact, over my shoulder there, I've got a print from 1863 or so called The Soldier's Dream. And it's a man who is at the battlefield. He's asleep. He's next to a fire. And actually, well, you can kind of see it here too. This is the front of the book. And so he's asleep, and there's a fire here, and the smoke rises up, and you can see his dream here, several sequences, being reunited with his wife and family and hugging them. And I think that was the most common dream. And I think that for soldiers, that was something that they looked forward to. You find it often at the end of soldiers' letters where they say, I look forward to going to dreamland, and I hope to see you there, something like that. But there were also nightmares of battle. There's no doubt about it. And sometimes soldiers wrote about these nightmares themselves. So they would wake up and they would have a bad dream, and they would write about it in a letter to their wives or their parents. Sometimes you find these nightmares because their bunkmate had a nightmare. And so I remember one that I found where a guy, he was an artillerist, and the guy sleeping next to him was having a nightmare about being in battle, and he's yelling, 1, 2, 3, load, 1, 2, 3, fire, and he's yelling at the top of his lungs. And so the bunkmate wakes up from that and writes about it. There are some that are almost comical today, although you have to imagine they were stressful back then, where a guy might be fast asleep and he's having a nightmare and he yells in his sleep, the rebels are coming. And I found at least 3 instances where that happens, where someone in his sleep yells, the rebels are coming, and the whole camp has to get up and get into line with their guns and figure out what's going on before they realize it was just a bad dream that someone had. So you find both. I think overall, though, at least the most reported dreams are those that were pleasant dreams of home. And I think that a lot of the modern research also sort of confirms that for people who experience combat, you're more likely to have those bad dreams of war after the experience of being at the battlefield is over.
Yeah, that seems to make a lot of sense, that then, once it's quiet, once life has gone back to some semblance of normalcy, that then your mind is reflecting on all of the things that you saw, but almost in the heat of it, you're thinking of the thing, your mind is going back to that normalcy.
That's right.
Seeking out, where you are comfortable and that sort of thing. So you mentioned all of these dreams, and I've done this since I've started kind of a pandemic journal for myself, and I have mentioned a few of the more ludicrous dreams that I've experienced over the last couple of months. So how were soldiers recording their dreams? Like, what mediums were they recording them in terms of, were they diaries, letters, and how do those different sources kind of differ?
Yeah, so you find them in letters and diaries, and then for the most part in my research, I relied on things that were written in the moment, so letters and diaries. I have one chapter that I didn't mention before that I call Dreams of the Dying. And in that chapter, I look at men who dreamt that they would be killed in battle and then were. And for that chapter, I relied on regimental histories. And so you have this incredible thing where a guy wakes up in the morning and he says, I'm going to be killed today. And his comrades kind of laugh at him and say it's not going to happen. And then he is killed that day. And 50 years later, they write it down in a memoir or in a regimental history. And if you think about it, I mean, most of us forget our dreams within minutes or hours of waking up, unless you do what you're doing and write them down. And so I tried to get at, why do these dreams mean so much to these veterans that they write them down 20, 30, 50 years later? And I think it's because of the sense that they had of dreams, that they were a sign from above. They gave a sense of meaning in the conflict. If you were dreaming and you were it was revealed to you that you were going to be killed that day, there was something superintending your death. And it could give you a sense that that it was part of something bigger than yourself and part of something meaningful. And so I used all these different kind of sources. For the letters, it's really interesting, even more so from the women writing to the men when they would write about their dreams. I found that women were far more likely to have bad dreams than soldiers were. Southern women are dreaming of invading Yankee armies. Northern women are dreaming about going to the battlefield. And the thing that they really wrestled with was how much do they share with their husbands, because they want to be intimate, they want to reveal what's going on in their minds and in their hearts, and yet they worry that if they share too much or make their husbands too fearful about what's going on at home, that the husband might desert. And so women really wrestle with this, and sometimes you find that they'll write something a little more detailed in their diaries than they do in their letters, because they want to try to protect their partner from what's really going on in their dreams.
So it does this all kind of begs the question, and then thinking about it from, not just the home front as you just kind of addressed, and also the soldiers in the field. How much do people at the time know about the importance of sleep, and more so that the health side of sleep?
I don't think they have a very good appreciation for it in the way that we understand now, that you need certain amount of sleep in order to function. Being home with two kids during the pandemic, and every morning is, seems to be an earlier morning than the previous one. Like, we know what it's like today to have what scientists call sleep debt. And the less sleep you get over a period of time, it compounds, and it makes it even harder for you to function. And sleep science shows us today that when you are so utterly exhausted, you can even begin to act as though you're drunk. And they had no conception, understandably so, they had no conception of that sort of scientific understanding of sleep back then. And one of the things I've wondered about, and I speculate about this in the book, and I'll never be able to answer definitively, but I've looked through a lot of court-martial records in the course of my research for this project and for other projects. And a lot of these guys who get court-martialed for falling asleep at their post get, part of the charge against them is that they're drunk. And in a number of cases, the men say, no, I wasn't drinking at all, or no, I didn't have enough to be drunk. But it may be that they were just so sleep deprived that that they appeared to be drunk, and so they get convicted in a military court for falling asleep at their post. And for the military officers, it's often, these guys are morally delinquent, and so they need to be punished to make an example of them. From the soldiers' perspective, people like Wyman White, they're like, hey, I can't function on 2 hours of sleep night after night after night. And so there's a disconnect there. Lincoln may have had a better sense of things than most people. Lincoln was noteworthy for not getting a lot of sleep during the war, and he pardoned a lot of these guys who fell asleep at their post. I will say one other thing. Obviously, it's really important for pickets to stay awake at night, because if the pickets fall asleep, then a camp is vulnerable to enemy attack. So there's a reason that the officers wanted the pickets to be awake all night. But there's a really difficult thing going on where when you're sleep deprived, it's hard to stay up night after night.
Yeah, that it's interesting. I didn't know about that fully know about that connection to Lincoln, and it makes sense. You always hear about Lincoln pardoning soldiers, and it makes sense that he didn't get a lot of sleep himself.
Yeah.
That he would understand kind of what that soldier experience was like.
That's right. And one of the most famous ones is a guy named William Scott from the 4th Vermont or 3rd Vermont. And he falls asleep in the summer of so it's the summer of 1861. He's up in your neck of the woods. He's near Georgetown in DC. And he's there with a couple friends, and one of them has picket duty for the night, and or guard duty, and the friend is sick. And so Private Scott says, well, I'll do it for you. So he stays up all night one night, and then the next night is his night to be on. And the way that they did it back then was, early in the war, if there were 3 guys on guard duty together, they would say, all right, let's take turns. You stay up for a couple hours, then you, then me. And that way, if someone comes by, we'll wake each other up and we'll all appear like we're awake. And so the second night, William Scott is supposed to be awake at one point, and he falls asleep because it's his second night awake. And when the officer comes by, the officer knows the kind of deals that were going on, and he says, who was supposed to be awake right now? And the 2 men point at William Scott, and it's him. And so William Scott gets sentenced to be executed, and Lincoln pardons him. And it's this really powerful moment in September of 61 where Lincoln shows mercy to this, farm boy from Vermont who didn't know any better. But it did set a pattern that Lincoln was prone to show mercy, and I think did show mercy in every case where someone was sentenced to be executed for falling asleep.
Yeah, so with Lincoln in mind, I know you mentioned, and there's a chapter in your book kind of about Lincoln and dreams. You know, kind of give us a brief overview of that. I think of when I think of dreaming in the Civil War. Honestly, I think Lincoln is the first thing that came to mind. I think of the movie Lincoln, and the ship.
Yep.
Yeah, so can you tell us a bit about Lincoln and dreaming during the war?
Sure. So there are two very famous dreams of Lincoln's, and the one is the one that you just mentioned. It's, I think, the second scene in the Spielberg Lincoln movie where he's on a ship and he's heading towards an unknown shore. And Lincoln had this dream on the last night that or morning that he woke up. So the morning of April 14th, 1865. And he went to a cabinet meeting that morning and he said, they were waiting for one of the cabinet officers to show up. And so he just starts telling stories, which is what he did a lot of. And he said, I had this dream again last night. And one of the cabinet officials says, what was it about? And he says, oh, it's the dream I've had before every major engagement of the war. And he then says, before Bull Run and Gettysburg and Wilmington and Stones River and all these other engagements, he had this dream. And it's where he's on a ship and he's heading towards an unknown shore. And he says in the cabinet meeting that he believes this is going to point towards something great happening. And he hopes it means that Joe Johnson will surrender to William Tecumseh Sherman. No one really thought that much about it in that moment. But then, of course, that night, Lincoln is shot. And then people who were in the room begin to remember it and write it down. And within days, the dream circulates. And there's a couple things about this dream that are really interesting. The one is, I think this dream is absolutely true because 4 of the men who were in that dream or in that meeting wrote it down or told someone about it who wrote it down. All of them then began to change the way the dream was told. And so Lincoln told it as something positive was going to happen. But in light of the assassination, it began to be seen as a negative dream, as a frightening dream. And in fact, the way it's depicted in the Spielberg movie, he's alone and he's afraid of this fast-moving vessel. And that is a sort of myth that emerged around the dream over time. The other thing that's really interesting to me about the dream is that the 4 people who then recorded it all placed themselves in the center of the conversation with Lincoln. Here's Lincoln at the end of his life predicting his death as the story becomes told. They want to be the one who has the conversation with Lincoln. And so doing the research for that, it was just so interesting to see how the dream report evolved over time. The other dream that's really famous is that Lincoln was in the White House and he heard all sorts of weeping and wailing, and he walks around and he can't see anyone. And eventually he makes it to the East Room, and there he sees a catafalque with a guard. And he goes up to the guard and he says, "Who is dead in the White House?" And the guard says, "The president. He's been shot by an assassin." And then all these people who are weeping become visible. And then Lincoln wakes up in a fright, and he opens up his Bible and he turns to a bunch of random passages of the Bible, and every one is about dreams or visions. And Lincoln is said to have had this dream about 10 days before he was assassinated. And I did a lot of research on this one, and I have to say, so I'll say this dream has a lot of purchase in our popular culture. I mean, most of the most famous Lincoln scholars have written about it. If you remember the show Touched by an Angel from the 80s, there's a whole episode of Touched by an Angel about this dream. But I was able to use digital resources to dig into the history of this dream. And I won't spoil it. I'll tell people they should pick up a copy of the book. And I explain how it is I think that this dream was a complete fabrication, a great story, but just made up to make Lincoln seem supernatural in a way.
So that makes me think, the idea that, well, one of them may or may not be true, but the idea of a prophetic dream. How many, yeah, through your research, how common were those kinds of dreams And I guess say more so, how many times did you see that soldiers went back and looked at those dreams and claimed that they were prophetic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I had about 100 of the sort of presentiments or prophetic dreams in that one chapter. And, you know, it's it's impossible to know how many of them are real and how many were not. In a lot of ways, though, if you think about it, in wartime, when there's 3 million men who are fighting, some of them are going to have this dream and report it, and it's going to come true, right? I mean, just the odds are in that favor. So I think it's plausible that most of the ones that I describe in the book really happened. That doesn't necessarily mean they were really prophetic, but I think it's likely that a lot of them really happened.
So that leads me to think, you know, did you come across stories of those soldiers saying that they were going to die in battle because they dreamed about it and then being okay?
There's a couple of those. Yeah, I have a few of those in the book as well. And there's one that I'm thinking of right now where a guy has that kind of dream, and then he gets hit by a spent ball, and it hits him and falls to the ground. It might have hit his sword or something, I don't know, or breastplate, I'm not sure, but it falls to the ground, and he picks it up and looks at it and he says, okay, well, I guess my dream was fulfilled, and then he survives through the war. So you find some things like that as well. And then some of the most interesting ones, and I've not known what to make of. I've done as much digging into these as I can. There are some where I found, I think, two like this, where a soldier is killed, and then the parents can't find the body, and they have a dream where someone comes to them, where the soldier, their son, comes to them and says, my body is buried under a tree at this part of the battlefield. And then the parents go and find it. There's actually an Alison Krauss song about one of those kind of dreams from the 1870s, in fact, now that I think about it. And so there is that sort of idea of visitation dreams that I think was fairly common, where a dead person would come back and might reveal something about their death to people. And I guess in some cases the revelation proved to be true.
Yeah, that makes me think of, well, where I'm at right now, with the missing soldiers office, and just, the idea of how many of these soldiers are lost, and their families have no idea what
Right.
happened to them, and just how traumatizing and how terrible that would have been in this, in that Victorian era, that era of the good death, to just not
Right.
have any contact with
Or
their loved
closure
ones.
in that sense.
Exactly. And I imagine that, a dream like that would have just been of such, whether or not they actually found the remains, dreams like that would have been, I guess, like many of the other dreams you mentioned, some would probably find comfort in them.
Hmm.
Others would probably be further, possibly further traumatized by the fact that, those dreams, would have happened. Is that visitation dream of dead, loved ones, of deceased soldiers, was that something that was common, or is that something that is more rare?
uh the report there I found a number of reports, but not as common as things like the going home. The most interesting one I found involved a woman from New Hampshire, and her husband was in, I think, the 12th New Hampshire. And she had the dream right the night before the Battle of Gettysburg begins in 1863. And in the dream, she hears a knock at the door. And so in her dream, she goes downstairs and opens up the door, and there's the specter or ghost of a boyhood friend of her husband's, who's in the same regiment. And this lieutenant goes right past her, down the hall into the parlor, and in her dream she silently follows him. And when she gets into the parlor, there's two coffins, and she goes to the first coffin, and she sees this childhood friend laying dead in the coffin. She looks at the other coffin, and it's empty, and there's a little trickle of blood coming out of the foot of the coffin. And she wakes up the next morning, and she doesn't tell anyone about this dream. She interprets it to mean that the lieutenant, his name was Henry French, that he would be killed very soon, and then that her husband, Charles Emery, his time had not yet come. And sure enough, a few days later, word comes that Lieutenant French had been killed at Gettysburg. Her husband lives for another year and then is mortally wounded at Cold Harbor in June of '64. And she rushes to Washington, D.C. and finds her husband at a hospital. And as she gets there shortly before he dies, and as he dies, she sees blood coming out of the foot of his bed. And she then later wrote, and she said that in that moment, her dream was fulfilled, where she saw her husband die with the blood coming out. And so, when you find those dreams, they really jump out at you. But I think they're not as common as the other more pleasant dreams.
How, like I said at the beginning here, I've encountered some of these kinds of things in my research. How did you get onto this topic? How did you, decide that, writing a book-length study of dreams in the Civil War was going to be something you were going to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things I've tried to do in all of my books is do something that no one else has done before. And so that was one of the things that appealed to me about this topic. But the idea itself actually came from reading a book called Founding Brothers by Joseph J. Ellis. It's a wonderful book about the founding generation, where Ellis takes the stories of 8 different founders, 7 men, and then Abigail Adams, and uses extended narratives to sort of make broader points about the American Revolution. And I have that book as an audiobook, and I've listened to it probably a dozen times, and I have whole portions of it memorized. And one of the sections of the book describes how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had been very close friends during the Revolution. And then by the 1790s, they become very bitter political enemies. But eventually, they are able to reconcile in the early 19th century through the efforts of a mutual friend of theirs named Benjamin Rush, who was a doctor in Philadelphia. And Ben Rush got them to start corresponding with one another. And one of the things that he did was he got them to write to each other about their dreams. And I remember, again, around 2008, I was rereading or re-listening to this book, and I was thinking, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to write a history of the Civil War through the dreams of the people who experienced it? And so in 2008, I started a folder in one of my file cabinets that I just wrote Civil War Dreams on it. And as I was working on other books and articles, I would, if I came across a mention of a dream, I would just tuck it away in that folder. And by 2013, I had enough to start writing. And so in May of 2013, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and I knew she was due in late May, and I knew the due date was coming soon. And so I was staying up really late working. And I remember staying up till about 4 a.m. writing this book. I was just starting. And I went to bed around 4, and at 7 a.m. my wife comes in. I hope this isn't TMI. She comes in and she wakes me up at 7, and she says, "I think my water broke." And she had thought the pregnancy was going to come later, or the birth was going to come later. And the first thing I said to her was, "You told me I had 2 more weeks." Um, so I lost a little bit of writing time there, but it ended up working out well. I would stay awake really late when my daughter, as an infant, was kind of up at night. And so I would lay her down on the couch next to me, and I would just write all night long. And I was able to knock the book out in about a year and a half or so. Because I'd had this good group of sources, and then I was an insomniac with a little kid there.
Yeah, it feels appropriate that you're writing this book through the night.
That's right. It's funny. I have as the epigraph or epigram at the beginning of the book a quote from Lincoln, where Lincoln is said to have said, "While others are asleep, I think. Night is the only time I have to think." And having little kids at home during the quarantine, that's often how it feels.
Yeah, there you go. There's some some prophetic words from Abraham Lincoln for all of us. Yeah, so I'm struck by this. You have this folder where you're collecting these these stories. So where did you come across most of these? Are these in archives? Are these sources where they in published volumes? So where were you coming across these dreams?
I found them all over. So I found a lot in archival collections. If I read a book that mentioned one, I would often then go and find the manuscript collection and see if I could find more. I mastered the art of using Google Books. I mean, it's so funny where most people think that if you Google something, the answer's in the first 3 hits. And it's remarkable if you dig deeper what you can find. And so I came up with all sorts of different search combinations that I would do to try to find things in published collections of letters and diaries. And so I remember one night staying up very late, and I went through 90 pages of Google Book result hits. So 900 books I looked through it one night. And what I would do then, if I found a book that had a lot of dream reports or a fair number of discussions of them, I would get a copy of the book, and then I would usually end up reading about a third of the book. So I would read the introduction, figure out who the person is, and then if I photocopied 80 pages out of the book, I would read all the letters around the dream report, so I could get a good sense of who the soldier is, because I wouldn't have time to read. I found 400 dream reports. I wouldn't have time to read all of the letters of all those dreamers, but I would try to get a sense of who they were and figure out how the dreams fit into their sort of Civil War experiences. And then the other thing, there are a lot of scholars who try to keep their research private, and they don't tell anyone what they're working on because they don't want to be scooped. And I'm the exact opposite. So I tell everyone what I'm working on. And then the beauty of it is people will say, hey, I found something that you may want to know about. And one friend emailed me and said, hey, I found a diary where a kid dreamed of George Washington and then enlisted the next day in April of '61. Wow, I never would have found that. Or a friend of mine named Michelle Crowell, who is the Civil War historian and expert at the Library of Congress. She acquired a diary of a POW at Andersonville, and before it became public, she was reading through it, and this prisoner had a dream where he's on a boat and all these other POWs are drowning around him. And I never would have found that in time for the book, except for she knew what I was working on. And so I try to pay it forward too. Whenever I know people are working on something, if I find something, I tell them about it. But I find that letting people know what you're working on is a great way to find sources that you never would have found otherwise.
That's words of wisdom there. Sharing is good.
Yeah,
Sharing's a good strategy. We've had that kind of experience at the museum as well, of letting people know if we're looking for something, and chances are sometimes things will turn up,
that's right.
and be pretty helpful. Well, I want to thank you so much, John, for coming on today and for taking time out of, I know, your busy schedule and your busy kids schedule.
Yeah, that's right.
To come on and talk with us. And again, out there, everybody, apologies for our technical difficulties today. But I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you, if you did find it interesting, you'll go out and get John's book, Midnight in America. I'm going to be putting that link to that in the comments, that you can find it, so you can pick this up and read through yourself. And I highly recommend doing that. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, or donating. You will be supporting our efforts, supporting these kinds of videos and these programs. And that means that we will be able to do more of them. So thank you all out there so much for watching. Thank you again, John, for coming on today, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much for having me.